You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the ACP-EU relations after 2020.
Political, economic, trade and development cooperation between the EU member states and 78 African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, members of the ACP group, is defined by the Cotonou Agreement.
But as this framework agreement is set to expire in 2020, a new relationship has to be designed, building on the achievements and addressing the shortcomings of the current contract. The EU's position is expected in 2017, but debate has already started. Stay with us.
Signed at the turn of the new century, the Cotonou Agreement is one of a kind, establishing a comprehensive partnership based on three main pillars: development cooperation, economic and trade relations, and political dialogue.
But the world has changed substantially since 2000. Challenges such as migration, climate change and terrorism have become more prominent, while the EU's preferential economic treatment granted to ACP countries is ceasing, except for the least developed ones.
The agreement has already been revised twice to adapt to the challenges of the time, but now that its expiry date is getting close, debate on a new framework for EU-ACP relations post-2020 is intensifying. But what's the balance of the current agreement?
According to the European Commission and the European External Action Service, it has had a positive impact on development, trade and the economy, but its political dimension has fallen short of its ambitions. For instance, political dialogue has not really contributed to improving democracy or the human rights record of countries which do not share the same values as the EU on issues such as LGBTI rights and international justice.
And although the African Peace Facility, financed by the EU, has contributed to the mitigation of many regional conflicts, political dialogue has not really contributed to tackling the root causes of violence.
On an economic key, and to comply with World Trade Organization rules, different economic partnerships have been negotiated between the EU and ACP countries, organised in distinct regional groupings. According to some analysts, this has actually contributed to the fragmentation of the partnership.
On migration and security issues, the different situations in Africa compared to Pacific and Caribbean countries, where migration is only a minor issue and political violence is much lower than in certain African countries, suggest that these issues will be better addressed in a more targeted framework.
Besides this, new partnerships such as the Joint Africa-EU Strategy and the 2012 Caribbean-EU Partnership are causing uncomfortable overlaps with the Cotonou provisions. So in conclusion, there is a serious need to rethink the relationship between the EU and the ACP countries after 2020. And some scenarios have already been sketched out. Stay with us.
One option is to keep the existing architecture and institutions and adapt them to be able to deal with the new global challenges such as climate change and migration. This scenario would be the easiest to implement, but it has two main weaknesses. It does not address the institutional overlap with other agreements, and it may be more difficult to agree on shared values than in the past, even among the EU member states.
A second option is to regionalise the partnership, meaning that relations between the EU and ACP countries would be defined by direct agreements with regional authorities. This would allow for a more tailored approach to country or region-specific needs, but negotiating comprehensive and legally binding agreements with some regions may prove a challenging task. Besides, there is the question of what would happen to the joint institutions, dispute settlement mechanisms and specific funding.
The third scenario contemplates keeping an umbrella agreement to address issues of common concern to all members, such as climate change and respect for human rights and the rule of law, and combining this with regional agreements on more specific issues. But this option may entail complicated negotiations at several levels.
A fourth scenario which is being contemplated is to replace the current partnership with a mix of regional and thematic partnerships, allowing partners to decide whether to join agreements on specific topics such as climate change and migration management. The advantage of this architecture is that it's more in line with the EU's objectives on policy coherence for development. But again, the institutional setup and funding model would be questioned.
So what do the main stakeholders think? Let's find out.
As the Lisbon Treaty reinforced the role of the European Parliament in the EU's negotiating process, MEPs will have a much greater say in shaping the next ACP-EU agreement, and no deal will pass without its consent. So what's their view?
Well, MEPs are clearly favouring a new partnership based on an ACP-EU framework combined with regional agreements, all equally binding. MEPs want to move away from a donor-recipient relationship and reinforce political dialogue between the partners.
They also want to integrate economic partnership agreements into the new framework and monitor respect for human rights, social and environmental standards. MEPs also want a stronger role for civil society and for regional and national parliaments, and have called for the European Development Fund to be included in the EU budget.
The Commission and the External Action Service also support an umbrella agreement defining common values and interests with tailor-made partnerships with each of the 3 ACP regions, very much along the lines of the third scenario. But at the level of member states, opinions are mixed, and so are national interests towards the region.
New Eastern European members don't have the same ties to ACP states as former colonial countries such as France, Spain or the UK, and the UK's withdrawal from the EU might also affect the balance of power and the level of funding.
There are indications that a majority of member states want to keep their influence in the ACP region and would favour a legally binding agreement more focused on challenges of mutual concern such as migration, security and climate change.
However, when it comes to money, they are more divided. Since including the European Development Fund in the EU budget would have very different financial impacts on member states. But what's the view of the ACP countries?
The economic and political rise of countries in the global south has reshuffled the development cooperation cards. The EU has lost part of its leverage because ACP countries can now turn to donors that are less demanding in terms of human rights and democratic governance, such as China.
However, the ACP group has said it remains attached to its partnership with the EU and wants a stronger, legally binding new agreement that builds on the main principles of Cotonou. Like the EU, they also want to move away from the traditional donor-recipient relation to have a more balanced partnership.
ACP countries would like to have a greater say on where the money goes, and so they have suggested setting up an endowment fund and are considering additional forms of development finance.
Formal negotiations on a new deal need to start in August 2018 at the latest, and one of the main challenges for the EU will be to keep its leverage in the region while remaining faithful to its principles.
Whatever its final shape, the new agreement will mark the end of an era and the beginning of a new relationship between the EU and the countries in the African, Caribbean and Pacific regions.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.